I do have a few notes that I wrote down in anticipation to do this. And I'm mainly going to talk about classical education, what classical education is, and then we'll engage in a little bit more of a conversation. And if you don't have questions, if you don't have comments, this thing's going to be over pretty quickly. So here we go. Here's my definition of classical education. And no, I don't have quotes from great scholars from 2 millennia ago. Here's what I wrote down. Up until the start of the 20th century, it was known as education. So we're talking about classical education. Well, it was just known as education. In fact, up until about the 1890s, maybe the turn of the century there, if you went to a school and got educated, you most likely had what we now call a classical education. So my good friend Terrence Moore, who's a colleague of mine, he ran a very successful charter school in Fort Collins, Colorado, called Ridgeview Classical School. It's a wonderful school. And he defines classical education as this: the education your grandparents or maybe your great-grandparents received. Once again, it was just called education. Another good friend of mine, Christian Koff, he's at the University of Colorado. He wrote a book called The Devil Knows Latin, which is just a really amusing book. But he calls classical education the latest fad in education that has been 2,500 years in the making. In other words, once again, classical education was education. That's what it was for a long time. So very, very quickly, we call it classical education because it primarily originated with the Greeks. So when we hear names like Aristotle, Plato, and all of it originated with the Greeks, was passed on to the Romans, who pretty much adopted it in their own style of education. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, we lost this kind of form of education, but it was recovered in the Middle Ages. In fact, a lot of the discussion that I had in the previous talk was about this Middle Age conception of what a classical education was. And so you notice that a lot of those paintings came, and those carvings and architecture came from that time. I would argue it was perfected in the Italian Renaissance, and that's why you had this great outgrowth of inventions, art, music, coming out of that time. I would say that it was passed on to England, and England promoted this idea of a classical education, which was then brought over to America, and many of the founding families of our country used a classical education in training their own children. So here are a few of the features of a classical education. Classical education tends to rely on the tried and true rather than the latest fads in education. It has a tendency, or it usually includes having an educated person, whether that's a parent or a teacher, in a room with children who are uneducated, and that person passing along wisdom to children. Classical education is about knowing things about the world because they're worth knowing. And I hinted at that a little bit in my answer in there, that there are some things that we should be promoting in schools, we should be doing in schools, just because it's right. And it might not show up on standardized tests, but we just know that this is what it means to be educated, and this is what it means to educate others. In contrast to that, and yes, I am pointing towards progressive education here. Progressive education thinks that we should teach, or we should know things in order to serve an immediate purpose. And if we cannot identify an immediate purpose for what we're teaching kids, then we shouldn't be teaching them. That's a very progressive idea. In fact, that's what you're going to experience in a lot of local public schools. And it's framed in the language of relevancy. How are the kids going to find this relevant? Of course we want to be able to connect with kids, but education shouldn't just be a mirror, right? right? Walk into classroom, here's what you have, look at what you have, right? Shouldn't education be something more than that? Pulling kids out of where they are. And so if you have a kid who spends every day walking around the shopping mall, and you go into classroom and you try to identify material that's relevant, you're allowing the shopping mall to dictate what you're doing in your classroom. And you're not offering students anything more than that. So it's about knowing things that are worth knowing rather than knowing things that serve an immediate purpose. It's very interesting that the progressive argument almost folds in on itself, right? Because it says, well, we're going to offer kids what they need to know in order to succeed out there. Well, how do people know what the world's going to look like in 20 years? So you're training people for what things are right now, not for what's going to happen in the next 20 years. You just can't do that. So it defeats its own purpose, I would argue. Classical education is about truth, goodness, and beauty. It admits up front that those things exist and they are worth pursuing. Now, if you were to walk into some classrooms in America and say truth, goodness, and beauty exist and they're worth pursuing, you'd be laughed out of that classroom. In fact, I've worked in teacher education now for about 15 years, and I can't imagine going back into my teacher education classroom and walking in and saying, hey, guess what? Truth, goodness, and beauty exist. And to some extent they can be known and they're worth pursuing. That's not what's going on in most teacher education programs. Classical education includes a moral component. Moral education is of fundamental importance. I need to tell you a quick story. There was a camp that came to Hillsdale College, and they have a program for kids where they teach a conflict resolution program. And they teach a particular technique where it's, I don't know if it's 12 steps, but it could be 8 steps, where if you encounter a conflict, you do step 1, and if that doesn't work, you move on to step 2. And they were talking about this program, about how to help students deal with conflict. And I know that this is a really, really big thing. Classical education would look at that program and say, that's only concentrating on technique, and it's not dealing with the individual himself or herself. Classical education, people who promote a classical education, they readily admit that developing character takes time, but that oftentimes the things that take time are the things most worthy of pursuit. And so we argue that when this group came in and they were promoting this technique of conflict resolution, we argued that we didn't think that moral education could be boiled down to a technique, and that it matters much more about cultivating the human being, and that cultivating that human being occurs through looking at history, looking at literature, looking at geography, looking at language as well. That's how you cultivate a moral person. And that's what is a major component of classical education. C.S. Lewis said, education without developing moral character makes clever devils. In other words, they know something, but they're still unchanged on the inside. One feature of classical education that commonly occurs, or is commonly in the curriculum, is the study of Latin. So classical refers to antiquity, and especially in the Middle Ages, Latin was the language of instruction. So many classical schools will have Latin as a part of the curriculum. Now, where that's introduced, it all depends. Some schools, in fact, I have a friend who runs a classical school. It's a private classical school, and he says, we have Latin in kindergarten. And I said, why do you have Latin in kindergarten? He said, because our parents love it. They like to be able to go tell their friends, guess what, my child's in kindergarten learning Latin. So I said, is there any other reason? No, that's it. We just like to be able to do that. But typically classical schools will start Latin usually in grade 2 or grade 4. The school that my kids go to, which is a classical school, they start grade 7. What they do is they start with a foreign language first. They start with French, believe it or not, in the first grade, and they offer French all the way up until the end of the 6th grade, in which they then transfer over into Latin. Now there are a variety of reasons why Latin is used. Of course, you've got the English argument that a lot of our words, especially words dealing with math, science, technology, are Latin-based kinds of words. And so it's useful for students to learn Latin so that they can understand their own language, and I think that's a great argument. But that's not the only argument. Latin is hard. Latin takes memorization, and I made a reference to schools not asking people to memorize things any longer. And it takes a kind of a discipline to learn. And so I'll go back to the moral character. Actually, Latin helps students develop character because there's not an immediate result. There's not an immediate payoff. It takes a long time. It takes work. And that's not the only reason to have Latin, but I think it is a good reason, and it shouldn't be ignored. All right, a couple more things here, and then we'll do this. The classical curriculum, I would argue, should have the following components. Now, these are going to sound really familiar because this is what schools should be doing, and it's what they used to be doing, but perhaps some schools have lost their way. So I already said Latin. They should have modern language, of course, English grammar, literature, mathematics, history, not social studies. You can have social studies, but oftentimes what happens is you have social studies of which history becomes a smaller and smaller and smaller component. I think kids need to have history. They need to know history. Science, music, art, and physical education. Physical education has a long history in the classical curriculum. It goes way back to the Greeks. Dealing with the physical human being. It's very interesting when we begin to cut things out of the curriculum, we often begin to cut out art and music and other things like that. I'll tell you about one school in Florida, because of a donor, really believed in music and wanted to see music education. All first graders take the violin, and they take 2 years of violin in this classical school. Not so that they'll continue on. In fact, after that, they can choose to take another instrument. But they said all of our kids are going to take the violin because not only are they going to learn about music, but they're going to actually learn music while they're playing. So the subjects are taught as real subjects, but there's also a connectivity so that history is related to literature, and maybe even mathematics is related to music. Do you remember on that chart I showed up there? Part of the quadrivium, it was music, was a mathematical art. And those of you who know music know that there's a lot of math, there's a lot of fractions in music. And there's a historical connection between music and mathematics. A classical education is not about fragmenting the curriculum, placing math over here and language over here and PE over here. It's about showing the relationship between these things. Now that's hard to do in a practical way, but it can be done. Now this last one that I wrote just last night as I was kind of thinking through this. Children's talents vary. Some students will catch on more quickly than others, but that doesn't mean that we give up on the curriculum. The idea of a classical education is that this is the kind of education that is valuable for all students. Not that they're going to acquire it all at the same time. In fact, that's when it falls on us to try to figure out a way where we can help them connect. But also, it's being patient. and realizing that a kid might really struggle, and that's okay. Education is a struggle. It should be a struggle, because that's part of the process. But it doesn't mean that we give up on the curriculum simply because kids struggle. And so the curriculum is key, and we're constantly trying to bring students along in that curriculum, realizing that students vary. But it's very interesting because students vary across the subjects as well. I was talking about that in there, where some of my students who are very, very good in the mathematical and logical, they do the diagram and suddenly, language makes sense to me, finally. Someone was able to show me how to connect that. I think that's very classical, trying to make that kind of connection. So, all right, that's what I have. I would be more than willing to let you describe the experiences you have had, or to tell stories, or even to ask questions, and maybe all of us together can come up with some answers. So,
I'll get started. I was the math guy in school, and it wasn't until I took a 12th grade business English class where they started to make those connections and diagramming that I finally figured out, hey, I can write. You know, it wasn't this monumental, impossible thing to do.
Right.
So I connect, wonderfully with your description. It really makes sense to me. When we started Thomas Jefferson Classical Academy in 1999, we purposely put out the name classical in there. We wanted to say we are a classical curriculum, but it always stuck in me that we adopted the state of North Carolina motto, esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. And ever since that really meant a lot to me. That I'm always paranoid. Are we really what we say we are?
Sure.
And I'm constantly trying to think through that. What does it really mean to be a classical school? And do we really do it well? And if not, how do we do it better? And I think for schools that are starting out, it's a challenge, because I look at the 9th grade, those first few years, and the parents as well as the kids, like, why are these kids taking Latin? It's useless. I mean, they had no interest in it. They didn't want anything to do with it. And I compared that to now, 15 years later, these kids are so engaged in Latin, they understand why it's important. I mean, it's amazing the transformation there.
Right.
So I'm always trying to say, I always want to try to think through, and I think you just gave a great description that helped me to understand, are we really a classical school? What are the things that you would look for in a school to say, I can go to this classroom and that classroom and say, this really is a classical school? I was going to ask you that question, but you just answered it for the last half hour.
Sure.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Good. Other comments or questions?
I wonder, how does this all fit in with all of the testing that's going on and all that kind of stuff? Because Latin is amazing, and I think that would be incredible, but how does that fit? Where does
Right. Well, I would refer to my previous comments when I was answering your question there. I am completely aware of testing, the requirements of the state. I was on a board of a charter school, and I was amazed at how much time we spent talking about state reporting and uploading test results and just all of this stuff. So I know that in order for you to be alive as a classical school, you have to do this. As a charter school, you have to do this, and we shouldn't ignore it. The state requires it, and to a certain extent, there should be some kind of accountability, right? Because you don't want anyone opening up a school, oh, we're just a charter school, just leave us alone. We're doing fine, there's no reason, for you to pay attention, and then you have anything except education going on in that school. There needs to be that accountability, and across a large scale, the easiest thing to do is to try to quantify the education, get a test result. The problem with quantification, high-stakes testing in classical education is oftentimes they're talking right past each other. Because I would argue the most important things of a classical education, moral development, it cannot be quantified. You can't put a score, this person's a 4 on this scale in moral development. How on earth can you do that? And yet, moral development is one of the key components of a classical education. So somehow you have to be able to speak the language of accountability and deal with it when you have to deal with it, and yet still keep your eyes on the ball in terms of classical education. I'll say one more thing. Terrence Moore, my colleague, he might have an extreme approach, and if you've met Terrence, you'll know he isn't apprehensive about anything. He ran his classical charter school in Colorado, and it might be different from state to state, but he came to the conclusion that we're going to do what's right. We're going to teach the right curriculum, and our test scores will take care of themselves. Now that might be naive. It might.
No, it's not.
Except for the fact, except for the fact he was number 2 in the state of Colorado across many, many years. In fact, as an administrator, if he came down the hall and heard a teacher doing test prep, he would walk into the class. You have to understand Terrence. He's very, very. He would walk into the classroom and say, "What's going on here? Get back to the curriculum. Let's teach the curriculum. The test scores will take care of themselves." And he proved it. And these were not just kids coming out of language-rich homes or anything. It's not creaming off the top. These were it was open to any student who would come there, and he was doing some amazing things by doing the right thing first, and then allowing the test scores to take care of themselves.
With the move to Common Core, the tests are going to follow that, and they specifically require Latin and Greek vocabulary to be taught, even at the grammar school level. So, and of course, you've got your SAT. If you know your Latin and Greek, you're going to do better on the SAT, biology. All of these tests require Latin.
Yeah. Until the tests change, and we heard in there about how tests could ignore spelling, grammar, and all these kinds of things. And at times testing has gotten out of whack. It usually doesn't last long though, because people hear stories like that where a kid could just scribble completely misspelled words on a page and get a perfect score. When the public begins to hear that kind of thing, there's usually an uproar, and they go back to grammar, they go back to spelling and all that. So if you're doing the right things, you're going to meet those standards through high stakes testing, I think, without any problem. You were going to say?
I was just going to say that after spending many years in the Marines, and then Mr. Mitchell likes to hire a lot of former veterans to come and help out in the schools and run the schools. My perception from an outsider from general education to coming in and working in education is just that our schools and charter schools are so different. Some teach different approaches, some teach different curriculum. They're always different. And I like the idea that you can kind of, if you get the right person to say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we want to do. The public schools, they don't intentionally do a bad job. They just have a structure where they can't go out of the limits of what they're supposed to do, the confines. But I think you were right in there when you mentioned charter schools. Really, if you get that right charter school leader who has a mindset, and today we do this way, a great comment about your school doing the same thing for 12 years, and you've probably seen in some of those years where that's really, really, really been important, and then you concentrate, and there's a few years you wonder, are we doing the right thing? And then you wonder, and I think that's a pattern that we go through, and we've gotten in the Roger Bacon Academy where we didn't do well with grammar. We're still working on that. Mr. Mitchell just told you we started 3 years ago with the Shirley grammar in the lower grades, and Carla's beat me up in the middle school. What are we doing for our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders now who don't have the grammar piece, who can't put a sentence together? Right. And I understand that, and it sometimes comes down to, budgetary. We've heard testing, which surely we all have to do well, but I agree too. I think if we do the right things, we're going to do all right on the testing. Our teachers are all worried about common exams and Common Core. I'm like, look, let's do the right thing. It's all going to work itself out in the end. Make sure the kids are where they're supposed to be. You can always adjust fire later on if we're way off base somewhere, which I highly doubt. But a lot of times when the state changes things, you get teachers worried, you get teachers worried. Everybody starts to worry about change.
That's right.
And a lot of times I think if you stick with the basics, and some of the things you mentioned in there really kind of struck a nerve with me. If we start right here all the time, we're probably going to be in good shape wherever the trend goes.
Yeah, that's right. And there is tremendous. I work in the education establishment, and I will tell you, there's extreme professional pressure when the next new thing comes up. And I was using an iPad here, The new thing is get an iPad into the hands of kids, and that's going to solve problems. It's a tool, like any tool. Let me give you an example. When I was teaching high school, the school district came to me. I was a Spanish teacher. I was a high school Spanish teacher. And the school came to me and said, we're implementing this new program of computers in the classroom. And I said, well, that's great. That'll help me keep track of my grades. And they said, no. These are student computers. We'll give you a computer, but we'll have student computers. And I said, well, I don't need computers because my classroom it's a language classroom. I need to be allowing them to hear the language. We need to be interacting. They said, no. We're going to put 3 computers. It's our approach to curriculum improvement. I said, I don't need it. Can I have the money and spend it on some? No, because it's a district-wide program. Mm-hmm. So what they did was they bought these really expensive, and they were Gateway, if you remember Gateway. They put these brand new Gateway computers in my room. They had a guy who his whole responsibility was setting these things up. Those 3 computers sat in the back of my room, and I never touched them. Because I was doing I was teaching, right? And yet, that's the solution. What's the latest fad? Computers in the classroom. Well, then we need to have iPads. Well, let's get every kid an iPad. But if you lose the fundamentals of teaching and learning, which is a relationship, I would argue, of the master coming to the student and hopefully passing along a rich tradition of learning, whether in science or history, but that's a relationship where a person cares about an individual enough to maybe even have high standards in terms of grammar. Another thing, you were talking about a quality curriculum. It's amazing how, even with high need students, you give them instruction in grammar, and it's like a steroid. Suddenly, this page of text that was meaning just a stream of letters, suddenly there is structure and order and a logic to them. So you teach them Latin, you teach them English grammar, you teach them how to read, and suddenly it's like, wow, they're able to actually see what this says. Our initial reaction is, what's the fad? Well, maybe iPads will help this student, right? They're not able to read, so maybe an iPad. iPad is a tool, just like a chalkboard is a tool. But true content is the thing that really gets kids going.
It's so unfortunate that so much taxpayer money right now is being spent, and I'm experiencing it personally, and people I know, is here's your money, and it's for computers, but that's not what we need. It's taxpayer money.
That's right.
What we need, is over here. Oh, no. What you need is computers. Give everybody an iPad, give everybody this, and then it is obscene.
It is.
In the charter world, though, a lot of it is perception. And what happens is there's a local high school in Columbus County who went out and bought, wasn't it iPads? I think since we're talking about it, a Macs. Every child in the high school got a Mac laptop. Well, all of our parents are like, the high school has it. Why don't the charter school? And the parents think, well, those children are better off because they have them than your children don't have anything. So a lot of what the lady mentioned in the front, and I apologize, I didn't get your name, is very true, that you can't just throw money at something and it'll fix it. But in the charter world, parents who bring kids to us, and those numbers are important, think.
And on top of that, the parent comes in and says, why doesn't my kid have an iPad? And you say, well, we're going to teach them Latin instead. That doesn't always do it. And that's why I was going to comment after your initial comment there. If you're going to run a school that has rigorous academics, maybe a classical curriculum, one of the hardest things, but one of the most important things, is the leader of that school. They better be able to, in about 2 minutes, reach parents who have not been classically educated, maybe haven't even been educated, maybe can't read above the 3rd grade level. But you have about a 2-minute window to explain why holding high standards, developing moral character, and caring about your student is what we're going to do here, and it's a lot better than any other school that's offering you all the bells and whistles. And you have about 2 minutes, because if you don't communicate ideas, in that 2 minutes you're gonna lose them forever. And that's a lot of what an administrator has to do, is say, this is why we're gonna do it. It's not the easy road, but it's the right road to do it. And we have a long tradition here. We're not about fads, because fads come and go. And identify those things as a fad. But say, we care enough about your child to do the hard things. We're gonna keep them safe, we're gonna love them, but we're also gonna do the hard things. That's how you sell classical curriculums.
We had that happen in our county. Rutherford County Schools gave a laptop to every kid, middle school through high school.
Mhm.
And I thought the same thing, oh my gosh, all these kids' families are gonna run. I found out the next year we had all these very bright kids with their parents coming to my office saying, we want to get in Thomas Jefferson. Ever since they gave everybody a laptop, they're not learning a thing. They're all playing and doing all the wrong things.
Yes.
They're not learning
I know,
anymore.
I wondered how do they police that? I mean,
They couldn't.
Yeah.
They they implemented before they had a plan. Now there are some schools that I hear, planned it out really well and very careful, slow steps, are implementing, technology fairly well, but it's still, it's still got to be blended. It can't be one or the other.
Well, and I don't want to concentrate too much on technology, because it's only one problem. I'll tell you another problem we had. When I was on our school board of our classical charter school, if you don't have a clear statement of what it is you're actually doing, and I'm not talking about the 2-minute pitch, I'm talking about a mission statement that every time you can point back to and say, this is who we are. So it came to the point where at the board meetings, the first act that we did was we had a person stand up and read the mission statement. And so here's who we are. Now, every decision we're going to make, it better match up with that. And I'll tell you how this got played out in a real way. One of our board meetings, we have public comment at the beginning and public comment at the end. And then we have our board meeting in the middle. Well, it came to the public comment at the end of the board meeting, and there was a mother who was a friend of the teacher. And so the teacher and the mother were in the front row, and we didn't have a big audience. There were more people on the board than were in the audience. But it came to the public comment time, and she raised her hand and began to talk about her 10th grader. Now, this 10th grader had transferred from another school primarily because it was unsafe, right? So it's not the pursuit of excellence, it's the pursuit of making it through the end of the day without getting beat up, right? So, but he had been in a school where there had not been a lot of demands, and now he had been in our school for about a half a year or so. And he was struggling. And so the mother was coming in and kind of asking us to adopt a more practical program. In other words, is there any way where this child can go to the local trade school and earn credit at your classical school? They would take a welding class. Couldn't that count? And the president of the board was trying to explain, well, this mother, who's very, very compassionate, just breaks down in tears. So here we are, the school board, this mother who cares very, very deeply about her child, in tears, crying about her child, she can't have him go back to the public school because he's unsafe there. But he's struggling in the school. And it's really hard as a board to say, we care about you. We care about your son as well. And the easy thing to do would be to hand him an iPad or to allow him to go do the welding class. But as soon as you do that, as soon as you begin to compromise in an unthoughtful way and begin to say, well, okay, maybe he can do welding then, and we'll just count that as this, and then it begins to slide and your curriculum begins to slide. And I would say one of the largest challenges we had was in the face of that raw emotion, that real emotion, saying, we care about you, and we care about you and all these other kids enough to say, no, he cannot take a welding class that's going to count for a history class. We're going to say he has to meet this requirement, because if we compromise here, we're going to compromise everywhere. And the school board has a hard job of saying, and that's why we have the mission statement, and we point to the mission statement and say, this is who we are, and every decision goes through that. It's not fun, but it's what you have to do to survive in the classical charter school environment.
Can I ask
Please.
a couple of practical questions? And I'm not a teacher, so what I may be saying is totally elementary to you all, so I apologize. But and I did have the privilege of going to Hillsdale last summer and hearing two of the most incredible days imaginable, talking about charter schools through the Barney Charter School Initiative, which was just a huge blessing, and I was grateful for that experience. I'm thinking about the state standards, the Common Core, and I think sometimes we say standards and curriculum and we mix them up a little bit.
Sure.
What I'm trying to get in my mind, to come 2 points here, in my mind is, and some folks in here were with me when we talked about policy governance, and by that meaning, in policy governance you have ends, which is what benefit for recipients at what cost, and ends being the things that what people are actually going to learn. It has nothing to do with the books or the,
Right.
you know, what the teachers,
That's
I mean,
right.
it has to do with what somebody going to learn.
That's right.
And I'm wondering, as I'm thinking through this, you know, if we went and looked at Common Core standards, I guess there's a lot of ends kind of things in there. In other words, they've got to learn this. There's ends in what you've talked about here in terms of character development, beauty, all of those things are ends. We want our students to learn those things. Okay, then, and somebody correct me in a minute, by the way, if I'm wrong about Common Core, because I'm wondering. And then my second point is just, okay, if we can, because that's our board's job. That's the biggest part of our board's job is what are they supposed to learn? And then my next question is curriculum-wise, you know, we've talked about the core knowledge. When I was at Hillsdale and just, you know, had the privilege of going over to Hillsdale Academy, we talked about curriculum, and that curriculum is available online. You know, you can go in there and see step by step that curriculum. And then I asked Phil about it, who's head of the Barney Initiative, and he said, hold on, don't be pulling that off, because we're getting ready to put out a new one or develop, if I'm saying that correctly. So those are kind of my 2 points in questions.
Right. So,
very practical.
Yeah. So we could talk a long time about Common Core, but I'll just kind of say a few things. If you've been in the education world for a long period of time, you've seen reforms come and go. In fact, you can look over the last 40 years, these popular programs come and go. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but I think Common Core is just another policy initiative that's spiking, and it's going to, perhaps 10 years from now, we'll look back and say, remember Common Core? What a joke. Now we've got to deal with this. In fact, it's happening right now. So Michigan, where I'm from, there is a bill on the floor right now to end our commitment to Common Core, and we're just one of many other states. Now, I'm not sure it's going to get through our legislature, and I'm not sure it's going to get through other states as well. But there are real cracks in the argument of Common Core. Interestingly enough, Common Core and core knowledge, there is a relationship between the two of them. E.D. Hirsch, who came up with core knowledge.
I just read that last night.
Yeah.
He's pushing.
He absolutely
he
is.
Common Core.
Diane Ravitch as well, and a number of people who are real reformers are pushing Common Core. And there are some wonderful elements to Common Core. I mean, the idea that you might be able to have the same curriculum in Tennessee as in Oregon, so if you have a kid move, they won't hear Charlotte's Web, 3 years in a row, that there are specific curricular elements that our kids should learn. The problem with that, though, is that education is the responsibility of the state. And so when you, initially the idea of Common Core is faulty because it's the government coming in, the national government coming in and establishing a curriculum, which it is explicitly not supposed to do. And it's doing an end around by saying, well, we're just giving money, but if you want the money, you've got to do the Common Core. So it's a real problem, and it's a problem that you're going to have to deal with because many of the states now, their standards are pretty much Common Core with, you know, their state draped over
But
top
those
of
are
it.
am I correct, or am I understand, I'm trying to understand, that's standards,
Right.
but not a curriculum.
Okay, right. So here's where it applies, right? The standards then become the element on which the tests are created. So you have the standard, you create the test. So it goes back to this original question. What then do we do? We're going to be tested on Common Core, and yet you're telling me to teach our kids Latin, right? So the default position is, well, we know what the standards are, we know what the tests are, let's look at those, and let's create a curriculum around those. That's a real problem because I just told you Common Core is one in a long line of policy reforms. And so the curriculum you create today is going to look very, very different in about 2 or 3 years. But the thing is, the curriculum we're talking about right now, classical curriculum, has been around and has withstood many of these policy initiatives. So it's a real problem. You have to live in a world where you have to meet standards that you know aren't going to be there very long, but if you want to get any kind of funding, if you want to exist, you have to meet those standards. And so it's a constant kind of a battle, and it's so incredible because the Common Core was promoted by many people who were in the reform movement. We've got to do this, we've got to have high standards. And now what is happening is it's getting in the way of schools that are trying to do the right thing. They already had a good curriculum, a curriculum that was way beyond what Common Core ever recommended. But isn't this sad? They're going to have to lower their curriculum or do something other than a quality curriculum in order to meet standards.
Or couldn't you just begin with your curriculum and you look at the standards and have the standards fit in where they naturally fit in with your curriculum? Because that's what we're doing.
Yeah, that's right.
And then your tests follow.
Yeah, but isn't that sad that we have to take that much time and effort and energy
Yes,
away
we had to do
from
it
all the good
before.
work?
We had to do it before anyway with North Carolina standards.
Right,
So.
and you'll have to do it again.
Yes,
Because the next
probably.
policy initiative that comes along, what you're almost going to need is someone with enough knowledge of the education establishment and enough understanding of what a classical curriculum is to be able to translate. So when they say, we want kids who can do higher order kinds of thinking, you look at your classical curriculum and you say, well, we teach grammar and then we also teach a little bit of logic. Higher order thinking, logic, that's what we're talking about here, even though they're using completely different terminology.
But, you know, again, and I do remember Terrence saying what you just said, just keep your classical curriculum going, you'll be fine on those tests.
That's right.
But if you, right now we do have to have a Common Core, and to me, the logical thing is what you want to achieve has got to come before you place the curriculum or something to it, as to how you're gonna get there.
I agree.
But I've heard folks I respect doing classical work say, okay, we got to do Common Core, but the core knowledge is going to, it's a good program, it's gonna do what you gotta do to meet your core.
Right, so, right.
Core that.
core this, core that, right. Well,
And then I'm also interested in what is that Phil was talking about in
Right.
terms of that resource.
right, so there is a difference between core knowledge and the Common Core, even though there's a historical relationship between the two. And one would assume that if you follow core knowledge, or as close as you possibly can, you're going to meet many, if not all, of the Common Core standards. Now, core knowledge and classical are not the same thing, but I think they can occur. There's enough overlap, and you can draw from core knowledge, as we are trying to do at Hillsdale. The classical charter schools that we're opening up, we're pretty much using core knowledge from about K-8, because that's where it ends. And then, and so we use a lot of the history, we use a lot of the literature that they recommend. They're very, very strong in that. But then we supplement our curriculum with things like Latin, English grammar, although core knowledge has language arts, it's not explicitly English grammar. So we go beyond that and say, no, we're going to actually emphasize English grammar. We're going to supplement what core knowledge is actually doing. And then in the math, core knowledge doesn't have its own math program, so our schools use Singapore math. Many of the schools use the Saxon math. So your question specifically about Hillsdale Academy. The reason why it's changing is because Hillsdale Academy is a private school, and yet we're trying to open up schools in the charter school community. So at Hillsdale Academy, they use some religious-based curricula. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify curricula that will meet our expectations about what a classical education is, but then can also be used in the charter school community. So that's where the changes are occurring to that specific program.
Because he did say, don't pull that off, wait, because we're doing.
Well, I think there's enough there.
Misunderstood.
Yeah, there's enough there that is really, really good.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and the curriculum guide at Hillsdale Academy was never meant to be kind of adopted wholesale. It was meant to be a recommendation. If you want to do this, you might want to do this. If you want kids reading great literature in the 6th grade, this is what great literature looks like. Core knowledge is doing that same kind of a thing. And so what we're doing now is we're trying to say, well, what can we use from core knowledge, but what do we add to it? And so we're in the process of compiling that, which will, I don't know if we'll call it the Hillsdale approach or something like that.
Do you have in y'all's arsenal of the ability in the 1st grade to say, you've learned this? I mean, I don't want it to sound like,
No.
and on the moral scale, you're 4.
That's
But
right.
1st grade,
Right.
we got this down.
Right. So I don't know if we, in fact, I know we're not going to go in the direction of a behavioral objective. So all students at the end of the 1st grade will be able to do that kind of a thing, right? But at the same time, it's much more in the context of here's what we offer, here's what students have read, here's what they know in this particular thing, not written as standards, but much more written as curriculum. Once again, it's not the student as the middle of the universe. It's the curriculum, and it's drawing the students to the curriculum to say, this is the best that can be known. Our kindergarten teacher has our students reading midway through the kindergarten year. And that's not because of the curriculum, by the way. I'll go back to what I stated in there. It's because she knows how to teach kids how to read.
Is she using comics?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And which?
She uses the Becca program, which is a Christian program. But I would.
So we can't use that.
No, but I would say that might not even be the best
Okay.
reading curriculum out there. There are much better programs, but it's not about the curriculum.